Okay, good afternoon, everybody joining in on a Friday afternoon, and also another week of reflecting and digesting and trying to find a position and a response. Hi. Trying to find kind of also possibilities to respond to the very grim situation in the Ukraine, which is only one of many wars going on at the moment on this planet, in solidarity with the people in Ukraine, but also in Sudan and in Yemen and in Gaza at this very moment. Thank you very much for joining the session, the Decoso meeting number 4. Decoso stands for Decolonizing Socialism, Entangled Internationalism. I'm going to introduce very briefly the Decoso framework. My name is Doreen Mende. I am the principal researcher of the Decoso project, which is a research study in various iterations, at this moment around 5 different iterations, to inquire into the long durées, the chronopolitics, the trans-historical trajectories that speak from a moment of internationalism, geopolitical alliances in regarding to a possibility of a communist horizon, through forms of practices in the field of expanded art, architecture, but also technology, a major concern for the research project that is funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation, is to understand the kind of legacies, or how Vinnit Agarwal, one of the project partners and also today one of our speakers, called it the limits and liminalities of those kind of decolonizing processes from the 20th century, how they are still possibly resonating in the present, how can we relate to them, but also what could be a decolonizing kind of positioning today in relation to relate back to such a historic moment of internationalism as a political project in macro political infrastructures, but also in forms of micro social and micro political practices that show themselves in forms of films, in forms of songs, in forms of cybernetic inventions, cybernetic speculations. And you can have a look on the website on entangledinternationalism.org, what kind of iterations the project has been fostering so far. And this session today, and I think that Radha will introduce the session more precisely and also introduce the speakers and the respondents for this Decoso meeting today, will specifically engage into the question of techno-politics, a techno-political urgency to understand our implicancy, our deep implicancies in algorithmic and digital infrastructures, and how they resonate through the question of a networking practice, connectivities, sharing, artistic practice in some iterations also of the research project, and much looking forward. And I would like to express my gratitude and my thanks indeed for Vinnit Agarwal and Patricia Reed to agreeing to participate today in this Decoso meeting, which also is a kind of a launch of the various digital platforms that the project has been developing in the last 1.5 years. And also my profound and deep gratitude for Ute Holl to come today to Geneva. We are all sitting here in our project headquarters, kind of, of the Decoso project here at Geneva, at the campus of the university. Thank you so much for coming and for joining in. And Ute will respond to that, what Vinnit and Patricia are going to offer and to share with us from their research in relation to the project and to their studies. And it's the first time that we are gathering actually in such a round also of friends and comrades here in the duration of the project. With us is also Lea Marie Nienhoff, the PhD candidate of the project, Wada Loy, collaboratrice scientifique, who has very much organized today's also Decoso meeting. Thank you so much, Wada. And also Lord Sellis, excuse me. No worries. Lord, thank you. Also a friend of the project and a friend also of, a friend and a comrade. And also Coach Ashton has joined us here today. And voila, thank you very much everyone for joining online. I can see many friends, many students, friends from Dresden, colleagues from Dresden. It's lovely to see you. Students have joined in, alumni have joined in. And I hand over the floor to Rada or the screen.
So thank you everybody and welcome also from my side. I would just like to introduce our speakers and respondents today. So we have Patricia Reed, who is joining us from Berlin, I believe. She's an artist, writer, and designer, originally from Canada, and obtained her bachelor at Concordia University, Montreal, and holds an MA in communications from the European Graduate School in Switzerland. Her works have been very widely shown in various museums and galleries all over the world, from Prague, Beirut, Vancouver, Oakland, Rotterdam, Berlin, and Geneva. Patricia is also a part of the Laboria Cubonics, the working group whose feminist manifesto was published in 2015 and has been very widely received. She has contributed to a very large number of publications. Her most recent writings have been published in the book Construction Sites for Possible Worlds, Urbanomic Press 2020, I believe. The New Normal, which was also published recently by Strelka Press in Moscow, then Para-Platforms, published by Sternberg in Berlin, Post-Memes, Seizing the Memes of Production, also published in 2020, and her essays have appeared very widely in publications such as eFlux and numerous others. Patricia is a master's tutor at the Design Academy Eindhoven in the Netherlands in the Critical Inquiry Lab, and she designed and created the online research tool for Decoso, which can be found under the link Entangled Internationalism.org. I will post the link later on in the chat for everyone interested. And we have Vinnit Agarwal. Hi, Vinnit. Very glad to have you with us. Vinnit is a poet and computer programmer and a 2019 graduate of the CCC here at Geneva. And Vinnit is joining us today from an artistic residency in Portugal, near Lisbon, I believe, yeah? Very happy to have you here as well, Vinnit. And Vinnit will speak more about himself, I guess, later on. And as a respondent, we have Ute Holl joining us here. She's a professor of media studies at the University of Basel. After completing her doctoral dissertation on the history of cinema of perception at the Humboldt University, she has held professorships at the Academy of Media Arts in Cologne, the Bauhaus University of Weimar, and Ruhr University in Bochum. Since 2009, Ute has been a professor of media aesthetics at the Seminar for Media Studies at the University of Basel, where her research focuses on the history of cinema and perception, techniques of visualizing and knowledge, the history of electroacoustics and radiophonics, as well as anthropologic and experimental cinema. She is a fellow of the Forscherkolleg Bildevidenz at the FU Berlin. And her most recent publications are the books Radiophonic Cultures from 2018 and Cinema, Trans and Cybernetics of 2017. Ute is a member of the advisory board of Decoso, and we are delighted that she is here in the office with us. Welcome. And with that, I would like to hand over to Vinnit and Patricia. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ada. Can everyone hear okay? Yeah? Okay, I'm assuming yes. Thanks so much for the invitation. I'm sure I speak for Vinnit, at least on that part. It's really wonderful to join you today. Obviously, really difficult day, so I echo Doreen's opening statements. And I'm not sure, Vinnit, like we didn't really decide on this sequence of things. Have you got a real zinger that you want to just like drop initially on us?
Well, I thought we could do like a preface so as to think of why did we actually bring in conversation the discussion about latency, and also the questions that we were thinking initially about complexity. And I think, maybe this was the initial thought that normally complexity is addressed as something at the end or something that one has to think more about, but we wanted to probably kind of think about complexity as starting point. So yeah, these were like kind of some of the thoughts. And I brought in some images and something to kind of discuss together. So I could share that, but maybe we can also open up the conversation. I mean, the idea is to have like the whole thing as a conversation and not really like a talk delivered to you, but kind of really like a conversation where everybody would join in.
Yeah, so I think we welcome any sort of participation or interjections that anyone may have. As Doreen mentioned, I guess you brought us together as the kind of quote unquote nerds of the project, behind the project. Vinnit was responsible for, and correct me if I'm wrong, but like building and architecting the database, the archives that are nourishing the research that is part of the sort of global project of the Decoso. And then we were in dialogue to try to, take inspiration from that for the sort of more front end facing, basically for the project where obviously everything kind of gets archived. And I guess the only thing that I would really say about that side of things from the design perspective is that it's obviously very tricky to get involved with projects that are starting out, right? Obviously there's a direction and there's actors involved and so on, but you're not entirely sure of like how it's going to go, right? Because that's part of the process of researching. So I'm actually kind of excited to have the capacity to like revisit, certain decisions that were made initially to kind of get the platform off the ground, and kind of engage with the research as it comes in to see how that may, alter the, certain design decisions and so on. And I think that's a kind of really important and great affordance of the web, is that, it's never written in stone. You can constantly be tweaking and changing. So I kind of very much had that sort of ethos in mind in embarking on the project. What is that? It's something that could be revisited and tweaked and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think we started kind of along with Doreen and Leah. There was this desire to constitute a library, and we thought of how do we think about a library of Decoso, which is obviously in the image of internationalism, but also there are indeed so many different parts to bring together in this library. So essentially how to think of a sort of a network of archives which are placed in different locations, and then how to think of like an infrastructure for the project, which is not only for the duration of the project for 4 or 5 years, but which can actually serve as a platform to go on. And on the front of archive, I think from the beginning, we were sort of aware of the critique of the archive, which is there always in terms of archive as a place of power, but also like a very specific place that addresses the questions of categorization, classification, and yeah, the actually the violence that archive exerts because of the abstraction as well. So that was probably one of the primary point where we kind of started thinking of doing an archive, dealing with the technological constraints of an archive, because of course, finally we have to write a program in the end, or create data structures which are defined by the technological constraints, and in the language of technology, they come from a certain lineage, which is, I mean, in the long thought, from the Renaissance to the industrialization to the colonization, and the aftermath of it. So it, of course, works inside the circles of rationality or the given rationalities. But then there was a desire to sort of see what is possible with this kind of structure. So I'm like always very enthusiastic in the moment by training as well. So also because, yeah, like as software engineer, and when you work in these large body shops, in which I worked for almost 7 or 8 years, it's hardwired inside you that there's a software development lifecycle, SDLC, and you follow the SDLC till death. So essentially, you take the requirements. Once you have the requirements, you create something that is called as low-level design document, sorry, the high-level design document, in which you place different components. So say we are going to take the data from different archives. What are the entities that will speak to each other, etc. And then in the low-level design document, we describe each of these entities. So say we will have contributors. Each of these contributors will have an email address. They will have a researcher ID. They will have certain sort of what we call in the programming languages properties. And it's always good to think of all of this both materially in the technological language, but also socially in the social languages. So we define classes, and we have properties, and we have like object-oriented programming concepts, which all of which can be related to various things of objectification and all of that. So yeah, so the initially we prepared this high-level diagram that maybe I can share now. Which has, so can you see it, right? Mm-hmm. So it has like all of these different connections that we sort of initially defined between these parts. And yeah, I mean, the desire was to see these interconnections in these different parts, and kind of to establish something that can communicate between different parts. But also, as you always have it in real life and in technological world, the designs that you make in the beginning of the projects are never the same what you have at the when you go live, or when you actually arrive in their live execution. So yeah, I mean, these were the kind of certain initial thought on the system, in which we wanted to address different needs of the project, different archives or bodies of information, and to see their interconnections between the data.
Maybe there's also something to be said here too about, you know, why the title, like what do we mean by this kind of high dimensionality? Because I think there's a really nice slippage between what we maybe in a non-technical way mean by that, what we mean by that geometrically, but then what we mean by that in terms of like a computational framework. It's just basically like high dimensionality in geometry is just basically refers to the number of coordinates that you require to localize any object. So 2D space, like a map, how you have longitude and latitude, right? 2D, you only need 2 coordinates and you can like position yourself. And so high dimensionality obviously refers to spaces where you need more and more coordinates in order to localize an object. At the same time, if you kind of reverse that, how do you imbue objects with higher dimensionality? And that is something that to me is always very exciting in building databases. I wasn't responsible for building this one, but in theory, is that through whatever taxonomies that you may introduce and how you classify or tag these various objects, certain objects will, because of the connections that are afforded by that type of encoding, you basically instantiate, you add dimensionality to these objects by increasing their relational properties, which I think, again, analogously, like, you know, obviously I'm biased here because I'm obsessed by entanglement, but obviously we're starting to get into that sort of territory as well, right? Where you're just talking about multiple modes of relationality and how do you find localization within that. It's interesting to kind of reverse apply that through this kind of you know, organization of the archive to increase the dimensionality of these various objects precisely by adding relations, which is usually a kind of runs counter to how we normally think about taxonomy, which is about like rigidity and fitting things in its box. It's like, actually, we could have the possibility to flip that.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, when we did start to map the data, it kind of sort of arrived at the point where the relationality itself began to explode, because sort of we began to realize that in a way, everything was related to everything. And so when we created this data map, which was actually how we would have data in the archive, and it's not very okay. Yeah. We would see actually that all of these entities and the properties were linked one from another. So I mean, the archive, we made it with the help of Data Center for Sciences and Humanities in Basel, who are just like this amazing group of people, helped us a lot to create the infrastructure. And they had prescribed us a model based in JSON, in JavaScript object notification, in which we would write this data. And so we created these basic entities, for example, a document, which are generalized and specific at the same point of time. Generalized because a document can be anything. It can be a PDF, it can be a video, it can be a sound object. It could also be a GIF, it could be like an animation file. So it's a document is a general placeholder, but at the same time, it is specified by the properties that are associated with this. So every document would have a title, a publication ID, a document type, data sources, so on and so forth. And then once we had defined these various entities and their properties, we had to establish a relationality between them. And this was, I think, the major task actually, to see which property is related in what many ways to others. Of course, like when we define the databases, there is a unique ID that we give to each of the rows or each of the records in the databases. And the way the relational databases, the RDBMS, which works, which are mostly, I mean, most of the databases today are RDBMS. The work is that each of the unique ID in each of these entities, for example, say document as a document ID, is referred by another object. So the person, let's say somebody wants to submit a document into the system. So it's a person wanting to submit a document in the system, and we would relate the person with the document. So essentially the document ID would be in a way referenced inside the entity of the person. So the person would have a reference to the document ID, which is a unique number for the document. In turn, the person also has a unique number called the person ID, and that person ID is referred here as an author ID. So there is like an interconnection both ways between the entities, and this is defined here two-way. But if you multiply this in relation with the other entities, for example, an archive or a conference or an exhibition, this relationality itself becomes a complex in terms of a matrix. It is not like merely a relationality between two nodes now. It's a relationality that is between multiple nodes, where each of the property becomes sort of like this tool of specification in this relationality. And maybe going further, there was also this desire to think about this relationality in a larger or a general sense. I mean, I was thinking, so this is like kind of a machine generated image that we had of this data model in the beginning. And the oval circles that we see are entities, the square circles are the properties. And so we can see that there is a constitution that is happening between the relationality. In a way, a world is being constituted based on the relationality between the entities. And here we arrive at this notice of world making, which we can think in what ways goes with data modeling and in what ways goes or in what ways exceeds the data modeling. So the very basic image of a network is just this, right? Like it's essentially the nodes and the relation between the nodes. And this is, I think, is very good to think also in relationship with internationalism or in different modes of coming together to think about world making process. Because we have had all of these models about relationality and the nodes. So, yeah. I mean, I'm like, maybe I will spill them out now and then we talk about them in detail later. But I was thinking that both inside the academia and inside the critical theory, we have a discussion of modes of coming together. So the earliest would be structuralism and kinship from Levi-Strauss, which probably kind of creates a way of othering despite itself, in which somebody moves from nature to human via the technology called culture, right? So this is like the kinship for Levi-Strauss, which produces a way of quote unquote othering. Then we have, of course, rhizomes in which there's no definite beginning or ending. So if this network is a complete network, then we can say it's not necessary that all of the communication will start from this node and will end on this node. Each of the node is a starting point and an ending point in certain ways. And so they constitute, I mean, they're using Guattari, they constitute something called interbeing. Another way of thinking about this relationality, which for Glissant is politics of relationship. This is also the relationality that we can think in relation to Latou's actor network theory in certain ways, which again is another way of thinking about connectedness or the modes of coming together. And finally, we can think of this relationality as something that is more in the image of internationalism, or internationalism as this political idea that defines our coming together. So these were certain academic notions. And then in the geopolitical notions, of course, we have the analogies starting from the League of Nations, going to United Nations, then coming to the non-aligned movement, moving to the socialist internationalism, the fallouts or the breaks in the globalization that we see both in the times of COVID, but also now in this precise moment, are certain sort of probably questions or things that we can also think while thinking of the network. So I mean, I just wanted to open up all of these different ideas so that we do not think of this only in the technological constellation, but truly in a techno-political constellation.
Right, and I think it's also important because a lot of these, I mean, I have a lot to say about this diagram because it's become my object of disdain. I can elaborate on that, but it's also how we, often how these diagrams, they become models for other things. For example, like how in the past we had, let's say, a mechanical image of the human mind, right? And then when certain technological affordances start happening, then we have a more networked sort of like model of the mind. So there's also this kind of the way certain like diagrams epitomize certain very general tendencies of thought in a given time. And I guess my worry about this particular diagram is relates to the problem of entanglement. Because when you talk about connectivity and relationality, like what is missing on this diagram, and it's not a critique of you, it's all network diagrams do this, is I have no understanding based on visioning this diagram of the qualitative, the nature of the quality between those things, right? So I can draw a line between myself and my biggest enemy. That's a type of relationship, right? If you just see two nodes and a line, then there's kind of this assumed affinity, right? And I think that's also why such diagrams lend themselves so easily to kind of conspiratorial thinking as well, because you you literally connect the dots, right? And so because I think that what troubles me about entanglement, especially how often used in the humanities, is as if like the sheer structure of it, because it's so, it often it's so readily correlates to what we mean by the planetary, that just the sheer structure of it often, like it's as if that alone implies some kind of like ethical or practical horizon of orientation, when in fact a lot of the entanglements that we may find ourselves in are involuntary. They can be punitive, right? And I think that helps us overcome certain discussions about exclusion and inclusion. It's like there's a lot of people that are described as excluded, but they're wholly included within this system in a very punitive way, and necessarily so for the operation of that system. So I've always been troubled by the kind of lack of semantic knowledge that these kinds of diagrams convey, even if they're helpful at a structural level. And yeah, because it really hit me. Like, I can say a little anecdote. It was probably more than 15 years ago. I was doing information cartography, dynamic information cartography, precisely for actor network theory-based applications. And So we were generating these kinds of diagrams, and then it just was, and it was basically using citation indexes and this and that. But yeah, it was never really showing me, it would show people who hated each other and cited each other in the negative all the time, their whole career spent just bickering, right, over a negative citation. But in the manifestation of the diagram, it gives that proximity, but it doesn't tell you like why they're proximate, right? That animosity. And so I think there's also something to be said about the way this it's not that it's unhelpful, but that it gets to that question that we were talking about in a sort of build up about like the necessity of reduction when we're talking about complexity, and obviously when we're talking about data modeling and feature spaces and all these sorts of things, but that there's like pernicious forms of reduction and let's say inductive forms of reduction versus like, I don't know, generative types of reduction. And it's interesting that in our sort of everyday language, that word reduction is, I mean, I do it too. You say, oh, you're being reductive, right? It's a pejorative, it's a kind of slur. But when we're actually talking about grappling with the complexity of this, material, geopolitical, social reality, there's a lot of information to be parsed. So there's going to have to be some necessary reduction on that. But I'm not sure what your thoughts are on it.
No, I totally agree. I mean, definitely, like all of these relationalities that are defined, it's quite telling that in these initial sort of simplistic diagrams, all of them seem to be more or less equally distributed across the space, but also all of these lines do not have any attributes. The nodes do have the attributes, but the relationality itself doesn't have the attribute. As if the relationality was, as you're saying, it didn't have any properties, or it didn't have any conditioning. So, I mean, this would be probably like something to think about in the image of the mediums. And when I was thinking about, for example, let's say this is an sort of an image drawn of blockchain networks, specifically of the network of the Bitcoin, which sort of works on a set of protocols. And here we see, in a way, formation of these clusters, which sort of gives you both kind of an elaboration of the entities, but at the same point of time does not complicate the relations that are there materially between the different nodes. So when we see this diagram, of course, we can think, okay, there are all of these mining nodes and the cluster of the mining nodes providing proof of work. And because there's a cluster, we can probably think about both their geolocations and closeness in geolocation, but also their collective weight or their collective ability to provide a proof of work. So yeah, I mean, there's like these clusters, which are again in terms of nodes, but not really in terms of like the materiality of the network. And I was thinking on two levels about this materiality of the relationality or the networks. One would be how they are constituted conceptually, so based on protocols. Each protocol is a set of rules which sort of binds any communication between the nodes. So say if I have to, or as we are connected today actually on Zoom on my computer and Zoom on your computer. So both of these Zooms are sort of like application interfaces, but what happens between these two Zooms is a set of protocols operating to make this communication possible. A set of rules that this messaging between me and you, between us, has to go through. And I was thinking maybe this protocol could be one way to define the materiality of this relationship between various nodes. But another very physical materiality is, of course, the network of cables. No, it's just not like in the air. It's a physical infrastructure that holds this virtual infrastructure. And for example, this is the map of the submarine cables that goes between various nodes between Japan, India, and of course across the oceans. And these huge networks of fiber optical cables are then like the sort of, again, material relationships that are happening between the various nodes. And not only the organizations that are working on or holding these cables as their property and defining their existence, their lengthening, their shortening, their multiplicity, again, kind of brings in this sort of like both governmentality in certain way, but also the material conception of these networks. And for example, this is like an image of a ship being loaded with optical fiber, which would then go under the sea for making these connections. And so all of there's like this material image of the web that is there in terms of both these fibers and cables, but also in terms of protocols, which probably would be. Can this be? I mean, this is like more an open question. Can this be an image of this relationality between the nodes that we are thinking, and what does it imply?
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting you raised this protocol, because I've heard like a nice little like tweet from Kia Kreutler, who was like, you know, the protocol, like governance happens at the level of the protocol now, or the institution is the protocol, something to that effect. But like kind of just like riffing off of what you're saying, I'm also wondering about, like, obviously protocol in a computational realm is highly formalized, and it must be formalizable, essentially, entity or operation. But then when we're talking about it in a sort of social domain, we both have formal and informal ones, you know, and this is like where I think it's interesting, where you can start to bring in something like the way that Sylvia Wynter picks up Frantz Fanon's sociogeny, how that gets reinforced through like technogeny, for example, but also like how these you know, like what is the role of these informal protocols, which I think are even like underwriting they're underwriting the data sets that produce this kind of inductive sort of mirroring of what's there. And by that, maybe just to clarify, I just mean like the way that if you just input a bunch of data, obviously it's historically encoded. This is like where the whole like bias in machine learning kind of comes up. It's historically encoded, so the patterns that it will find are going to be reflective and entrenching existing social biases and norms, and just spew that out, essentially, right? So you get kind of caught up in this trap of precedence, right? If you have societies organized a certain way and all the data is encoded with that, well, guess what? You're going to get like versions of that spewed back out at you. So one question maybe I have for you, because you have much more concrete experience in engineering, for those that are not in this field, like the front end web people, we're just like the low, you know, front end, just that's it. So my question is, because I'm really interested in this, in the way, in let's say the rule governed space, right? And obviously, again, in computation, this has to be highly formalized. But these operations happen at a social level as well, right? I'm born, I need to get educated, I need a job, I need money, I need to pay the rent. So these are also protocols of being a, encoded as a normative functioning person in a Western society. And so there's this kind of game space that's set up. And obviously it's a challenge enough within the social realm to learn how to develop, what Winter calls outer views in order to think outside of those frameworks. But I'm really curious about how this maybe relates to something like what Simondon talks about, like a sensitivity to information, right? Like, so is it possible at the level of engineering to have protocols that are sensitive to information or sensitive to stimuli at a certain point that can modify themselves, right? So they'd be, I mean, I guess that's in a way a premise of how machine learning ought to function. But do you have any thoughts on that? Like, what is the relation? Like, how do protocols change without a hard, heavy hand? If you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to think about protocols changing because normally you are conditioned as a programmer. You are conditioned to control the input and output. So to control the input, we have like all of these validation checks. So essentially, when somebody would write in a box an email address and would not put an @ sign inside it, then the validation will say, hey, your input is not correct. Please correct your input. So in terms of controlling, so there's a part of the code that corresponds to controlling the input. And there's a part of code that corresponds to controlling the output, which is actually based on the desire of what you get. And in between, there's a process. And in the process, you can have all of these factors, which is like, of course, based on the algorithmic or process flow of the program, but also the infrastructure elements. So for example, if a request is routed through different sort of networks, then the output would be different, even if the algorithmic flow is the same. So normally you are conditioned to think of a sort of, normally you are conditioned to think of the protocol as something that is fixed, unalterable, and thereby reliable and sustainable, right? So it's, again, it's like its governmentality is then driven on the basis of sort of controlled input and outputs that are generated. But having said that, when I was thinking about blockchains, which sort of now, in a very general and fashionable way, kind of speak of decentralization and thereby a certain sort of democratic participation. And there are also these ideas of constituting a nation state based on blockchain, which would be then democratic by its own constitution. And then we can examine all of these ideas. But there have been these two key protocols that have been running the blockchain. And here I'm not interested in cryptocurrency as kind of the financial outcome of it, but I'm interested in blockchain as technology. And so these two protocols, one of them is proof of work, which is used for Bitcoin, in which every node provides a proof that they can verify the information. If all of the nodes provide the same information, that that piece of information is registered and added to the chain. But the fallback of this protocol is like a 50-50 attack, or what we call as a double spend attack, in which if you can provide more than 50% of the nodes, so say if the 51% of the nodes are saying this is the right piece of information, then that would be considered as the right piece of information. So to actually attack the proof of work protocol, you have to have a capacity to have 51% of mining nodes which is a huge amount of mining nodes, right? So it requires that physical capacity or heavy hand actually to alter this protocol. In case of other protocols, for example, Ethereum, or where we have proof of stake, you put a certain amount on the verifiability of these transactions. So if you do not, I mean, if that amount is not verifiable, so if the information is not verifiable, then you lose that amount. And these protocols are sometimes more vulnerable. But there comes a catch as a technological worker. One, that as much as you test them, you make them stronger, these protocols. As much as you test them, you make it less vulnerable, and thereby less, to use that word, sensitive to what is being given to them, and you limit the possibility. Or if you leave them vulnerable, then the reliability or the designated function of that whole thing. For example, if you were constituting a nation based on blockchain, that whole nation will collapse because there is an inherent vulnerability on this. So there is like this catch of which is like you're always torn in between, right? Is it right to be a good worker of technology, or should you be a bad worker of the technology? And it's like very much into this politics of labor as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what to say. Does anyone want to jump in or have anything to say? I mean, yeah, because I was like really trying to think about this in terms of like less on the actual like database and the organization of this particular archive, but just trying to think about as well, like you know, perhaps less practical questions or less instrumental questions, but more conceptual questions insofar as like working off the premise that if we are to you know, like first having some doubt if we want to maintain a kind of internationalism in the sense that you still uphold and recognize the organizational capacity of a state form. To me, that ought to be a bit of an open question, given the legacy of how to organize the earth into states as such. Is that the right structure for the problems that are facing you know, the planetary scale problems? So that's kind of a question. But then also the question of, because I think like one thing that of course is so obvious with the problems of the planetary is that it defies facile localization, right? So even a state can't be, but its activities in the world supersede any territorial boundaries, and there's no mechanisms to really cope with that. So, and to me, this relates to the problem of figuring space within a planetary condition, which to me means if you are going to insist on the premise of entanglement as constitutive of the planetary, and that is supposed to be qualitatively different from the space of the modern come global, then what is that new space? And how does that change the way we understand localization, which is very different from the local, I would say, as in the phenomenologically available, you know, presenting itself as local to a human. So I prefer localization rather. So, and then if you understand space differently, which certainly mathematics has a more recent history of radically undoing what is given to us in linear Euclidean space. And that's probably why we learn Euclidean geometry as children, because it really fits well with our sensorium as humans. But then if you transform the spatial conditions, or you refigure what space is, then that will also have implications on how you understand activity agency and accountability within it, which is no longer containable at a mechanical level of like immediate accountability. That exists, but it also is, that scale of accountability does exist, but it also is not enough to account for the type of the transformation of agency and responsibility at this sort of scale of coexistence. So those have been some of the questions that I've been trying to grapple with, is really talking about, like, what do we mean when we talk about the site of activity today? And is it possible to speak of a site in only one dimension, or do you need to pass it through various scales of relative dimension in order to kind of build some sort of comparative picture of what one is doing or how something is situated? So those have been more the sort of, I guess, research questions that have been preoccupying me, which are obviously getting into the, speaking more to computation on the modeling level rather than on the, which of course is data processing, but like, and then how those models then become props, if in a way cognitive props, for us to reimagine, like what it, reimagine humanness or these sorts of things. So really interested in that sort of feedback dynamic between those series of activities. But yeah, that's that's the kind of short version of where I've been, particularly focused on that entanglement, and then asking if the international is the right, do we need to give that deference? Obviously it has an important history, but is that the organizational structure that we need? I mean, I don't have an answer for this. It's and it's certainly not going to disappear overnight. So what I'm suggesting is not in any way an immediately practical, idea. But it is to recognize the contingency of that form that has become very naturalized, such that, you could, critically ask yourself if we're also not like, unfortunate, like, if we're not like limiting our scope of possible activity by remaining within that framework of the nation state as such, where we can only have relations between the states, because that's what that sort of term implies.
Yeah. And if I can just like add to that question, what you were saying earlier about Sylvia Wynter's work, it also kind of helps to think about technological humanism, or like humanism which is required by technology and the technology that is made for humans, if the figure of the human itself is fractured. So what does it even mean to think about nation state when human itself is fractured into, in words of Sylvia Wynter, man 1, man 2, and man 3. So if, so I mean, how do we think of internationalism that is contingent on the condition of the essential fracture inside the figure of human itself?
Yeah, I mean, Ute, how are you doing? Do you have some words of insight you would love to drop on us? Or questions, or criticisms, or downright negations?
Okay. No, I'm really impressed. Can you hear me this way?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. I'm really impressed, and I'm not sure. Do I see you at all? Can you switch back to the? Yes.
Oh, yeah. I should stop sharing.
Yeah, that's much nicer, so I can see you. So I'm really impressed, and I'm not sure that I can answer on all of those, highly technological informatics questions. There's rather structural comments I think I can make. But thank you. I realize that I have missed a lot of workshops and discussions, and that I need to catch up. The first thing I would like to say is that not as of today, but for a long time, maybe for 200 years, we should have been aware of the fact that there is no possibility to detach the technical from the biological and the political. I mean, this is the basis of network theory, and also talking from Geneva, that's quite an interesting point of departure, considering that the CERN developed the internet. So the question would be, if we are talking about something like actor network socialism, what are we doing? Who do we listen to? And what have you been proposing? I should think that data management in itself is a problem that has led to quite the downfall of quite a lot of real socialisms. No? Because it was actually the digital procedures that sort of challenged the old administrations and the old forms of distribution. So everything that you've been saying and modeling and theorizing is really important. However, I think we should be conscious of the fact that it is not so easy with those diagrams you've been showing, or for me, it's not easy in those diagrams to find a spot of something like critical thinking, critical inventions, and protest. I really have difficulties in finding all of that. But let me go step by step. I really like the way you were theorizing on the modes of connectivity as problems, not only of access, participation, but also, and I think this is the huge difficulty we're facing today, of not only connecting, but to have a socialist way of collectivity. What does that mean? We don't really know. And those diagrams you've been, I want to make another remark, which might be interesting. A diagram is always, but here I'm only repeating Foucault, is always a representation of something which is there. So it is a representational manner as well as an operational and productive thing. So this for me is a really important issue. Where do we import old infrastructures when we make diagrams as yours, which is admirable, but at the same time, of course, reminds us all of the original internet diagram with packet switching and everything else, which is a military device in the end, even if people don't always agree. I was very interested when Patricia reminded us that those relations don't necessarily mean that there is homogeneity or solidarity or anything like that, but it could also mean something like friend and foe. On the other hand, I don't know if you, of course you are, you know that article by Wendy Jones, who said the heterogeneous is important in any sort of network. It is not so simple as just to draw lines between the homogeneous. And I think those things have become more complex in themselves. Those lines are not innocent, and those lines not only represent and project, but they also produce relationships. And I think this is one of the difficulties I'd like to address in our discussions. Then another thing I'd like to talk about is the abstraction, because of course you know that the network was already in the 18th century devised as an abstraction of all natural characteristics or qualities. Euler could draw his internet lines and calculate them make them rational and economic, because he left out all sorts of natural procedures. And I think this is exactly what we are faced with today. And since Doreen was mentioning the big schlamassel, how do you translate schlamassel? The big, the wars we are in today.
The big mess.
The mess, exactly. I was looking for that word. The mess today is actually that on the one hand, we have, as somebody already underlined, the fossil logics of the old Russia or Soviet Union, or what is left of that kind of economics. And at the same time, we can see now that it is exactly the present Russia that is relying on the Bitcoin economy, completely erasing all sorts of security measures that people have thought could economically stop the big, the weapon and of course, well, everything that is connected to it, like darknet, pornography, prostitution, and of course the women's trade that is connected to that. And as you know, and this is what I am really thinking about, that all of that blockchain and Bitcoin production is really a threat to environment. No? So again, we have here the impossibility to distinguish between biological or environmental procedures and processes, of technical ones, whatever we do, and even that innocent conversation we're having here is eating up resources which are not ours, but which are the resources of people who live on the periphery of the world, very often in former regions that were colonial, where the big server farms are located now. And that makes it a political issue already to use that and to be talking about huge, larger or smaller, about complex or lesser complex structures and infrastructures. And I was just, and I don't know, there's a lot to say about that. I am not doing this in order to sort of criticize what you have done, but to raise the question where critical thinking is or should be located now, and who can participate in that. I just want to add that huge parts of migration, and as the Guterres said the other day, it is now 3 billion people who are forced to migrate because we are, with our innocent conversations, ruining the environment. They do have amongst themselves developed quite an intricate and highly complex form of communication in virtual space. Communicating routes, exchanging money, communicating safe spaces, communicating transport and possibilities to work. So there we have a self-organizing form of communication in networks. And I don't want to idealize that, because of course there's a lot of violence included in that. So there's no need to idealize that. But what is also true is that in those small forms of virtual communication that are developed en route, we have different people participating. We have small children and young people who sort of run the thing. We have women who rely on that. And of course we have, and this is the problem, the huge corporately run platforms who cash in. Okay, excuse me for that negative sort of take on that. But I think it is necessary to also remember those things when we are projecting on what socialism and what solidarity and what rescue could be.
No,
Thank you for asking me to come.
yeah, no, I'm really grateful you raised them because it's all completely. I mean, I don't read it as negative at all. It's just it's real. It's you know, it's like a fact. So it needs to be contended with. I'm just trying to think of like where to start because you mapped out so many important things. One thing, I mean, the one thing that just to tie it back to something that Vinnit mentioned right early from the onset, right, was just like the separation of some humans from nature because of culture, and because you cannot separate culture from technology, as Simondon tells us, then you already get this kind of split, right? And the of course what the big the big sort of like metaphysical move, if you want, or and even represented it throughout Renaissance era European art, is the separation of figure from ground. And so there's a really important metaphysical move that allows the human to then see, understand the world as external to itself, right? And I've been thinking about this a lot through Denise Ferreira da Silva has this kind of principle, difference without separability. And it's a very complicated notion. It's a beautiful turn of phrase, obviously ties into this entanglement. And when you really start to think about it, it's really difficult. And I started to think about it in terms of, in terms of the problem of reattaching the figure to the ground, as Europeans need to do that. It was not a universally human-made move, right? That was a very European move. But I think it also ended up, it's only through that metaphysical move that you can enable the very concept of something like negative externality in economics, right? Of which climate change or climate catastrophe is basically the biggest negative externality coming to bite us in the ass, in a sense. And so I was really interested in tracing, like seeing how those, because I take the point about this abstraction. At the same time, I think when people are inventing these self-conceptions, human self-conceptions, they're extremely abstract, right? And so to kind of create these definitions and then you start to perform them into reality, right? That these abstract, I mean, it's just to say that we can't like hold the concrete and the abstract as if they're kind of antithetical. They really nourish one another at many levels. So the way that, and so I've been thinking about this kind of, the problem that you outlined about, obviously the kind of energy depletion that is going on with all of this technology, and often for very trivial ends, right? We're just sending likes and hearts and whatever. We're not using it in the most sort of productive way. But it's just to say that I think that like a lot of that you can trace a very interesting genealogy, and you kind of end up in this with this abstract origin in a way. But I'm not sure. I don't want to take up too much time. Vinnit, did you want to pipe in and say something?
No, I just want to add in regarding this sort of and from experiential side, like from like being in this machine of like kind of working in this large body shops, which are like mostly in onshore offshore model. There's like really like kind of quite hard economy attached to them. I mean, you're working for a US project as a programmer because the project manager is charging them $50 a person an hour, and they can pay you like $10 a person an hour. So there's like this very sort of a clear-cut line of economics that sort of builds into this. And I'm talking about this because so many times as a programmer, I was attracted towards the politics of open source, or the small networks which were our own, where we were creating these systems which would kind of elude the larger systems, which were systems for which were like our sites of agency, in a way in which we were like kind of protesting and working against the networks, where we were hacking the different systems. But in the end, we realized that it's just this. I mean, it's recuperated and it makes the system stronger. So all of, for example, I mean, to take a very concrete example, in 2010-11, I was working on a such system for Microsoft called FAST. And in 2011, I left the organization and joined another one. And in 2013, we discovered that the same search system is now being used by Microsoft in different technologies, where they allow the government to check the logs, essentially, of these organizations. So all of the transactions that they would make would essentially be visible to the government inside the search system. And so many times when we are trying to do something which is kind of a site of resistance, or which we take as a site of resistance, it becomes actually a mean to enable the system more. And probably that's also like kind of sort of my thinking about, which is like kind of probably a sort of a very hard pessimism into this. But as I've seen this over the years, most of the time, the heterogeneity or the politics of inclusion inside the institution is actually to make these institutions stronger. And I'm using institution as a word which we can scale up on different levels. But I mean, that's the question for me right now, to think about inclusion or abolition. And if you're thinking about abolition, then in which forms do we think of inclusion?
I think perhaps there are some also responses or thoughts from those who joined, or Ute would like to add something. I would have perhaps also something to feedback, or Kojo, or no? Oh, you go ahead. You go ahead.
Okay.
Stopped.
Well, no, thank you.
I could do a very small comment.
Go ahead, Lord, please.
But I think I put it up here.
Sure.
So should I go here?
Yeah.
I mean, I put it online. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I have a fancy microphone.
Mm-hmm.
Hello. Yeah, I was just. I'm just thinking out loud here, but it's a thought that I kept on having while listening to this kind of very exciting and complicated conversation. It's actually Gabriel Catran. I think some of you might be familiar with his work, and who's working for the Sphere Institute, and I know his work through like attending a fascinating workshop on category theory for non-mathematicians, and category theory, which is also very much precisely about thinking the relations between sets and things and entities and so on. And he kept on insisting on the idea of the question of abstraction. And
oh, you just muted. You're muted now. It just happened.
to unmute.
Oh, good.
So I was saying what he was saying on abstraction, like in the process of abstraction, the necessity of oblivion somehow is, yes, absolutely necessary, but that the problem is that we should not forget what we forgot. And I was wondering, in those questions of diagram and presentation, representation and production, how to kind of, and I mean, it's really a question on the level of perception and understanding, how to kind of,
Keep it in mind.
Yeah, keep it in mind, or have a mode of like have a simultaneous mode of having to let go of something while re-including it. I mean, it's a temporal question, but it's also yeah, a very methodological question. And yeah, it just kept on coming back to the conversation. Sorry?
It sounds like recursion.
Recursion.
It sounds like recursion. And yeah, isn't it? I mean, just when I'm like trying to imagine a procedure of what you're saying, like an operation, it sounds a bit like recursion, which doesn't necessarily mean like just repeating itself, right? Like there's deviation in recursion, because it's like, I don't know. I guess that would be more my take on it. I mean, there was also this interesting thing, like maybe you're familiar with it, the paper on machinic intelligence from Turing, like I think it's from 48. So and there's really some interesting observations there that are like still with us today in terms of social projection or social worry about machines gaining some whatever. But a few points in there were quite interesting. And one is basically the equation of, how does anything learn? It's through interference, which I think is a really important thing. And that includes humans. And there's a point where, and that ties into that sensitivity to information, right? Where you have a certain setting, your habits of thought. It's not even that this applies to only machines, but you have habits of thought. And at a certain point, you also are unwilling or unable or what have you to process certain interferences that don't conform to how you normally parse them, right? Like, it's like Catherine Hale says, like, cognition's really expensive. It's a big energy to change your mind about things. And then the other thing that was also about this was just like, for the Turing thing, was also just the observation. It's obvious, but I'd never seen it so spelled out like that, which is basically like the complexity of any entity is only as strong as its capacity for memory. So, and he's playing with this kind of terms that are both a problem in machines, but also problems in human cognition. And so that...
Okay. Don't worry. Sorry.
No. So it's just to say that I think that seems to tie in very well to the broader topic that we wanted to like put on the table, was starting from and this kind of like heightened memory function, which is, yes, like, I mean, I love that turn of phrase, like, not forget what we forgot.
If I can just add something here. At the same time, I think it is not just about changing one's mind or something like that, but actually changing the focus of what one investigates. For instance, Turing on the one hand and Shannon on the other hand, of course, they were quite aware of the materiality of communication. And Claude Shannon was it because he worked for the telephone companies that sort of forced him to regulate the channel capacities in order to save on copper. And that's what he did. But nowhere in his work will you find a reference to the Peruvian copper mines and the labor that happened in them. Nowhere. No? And I think those kind of little things on materiality are so important to actually take a completely different take on the what we think about communication. And even things like the distinction between culture and nature is, of course, a Western or a European philosophical construction, which allows us to forget without remembering that we forget. No. And I think that that's a very radical way of beginning to sort of step back from a European form of truth.
Can you say more what you mean by European form of truth as opposed to, do you mean that there's other forms of truth, or that Europeans are obsessed with truth?
No. I think that, of course, there is a historical kernel to whatever truth is in a discursive mode of any society. No? But I think that there are certain things that we can say have contributed to the European mode of Klärung. Enlightenment in a general way, and that fierce distinction of culture and nature is one of those constructions, which is not shared by, I think, Decoso says by 80% of other societies of the world. So what does it allow you for? It allows you to sort of, I mean, that's exactly Adorno's intervention. It allows you to disregard any connections you would have to something connected to growth, to other forms of creatures, and so on and so forth. And still it is difficult for us to sort of think in that way. And I'm saying us here as a representative of that mode.
It produced a certain cosmology. I mean, that's how I try to think about it, is like it kind of induces a certain cosmological predisposition, and that affects even, like, there's a really great book from this international relations scholar Vinnit Agarwal, where he's talking about the way cosmology set the kind of telos of orientation. And so you have to ask yourself, like, how did Europeans go from their purpose was to serve God in glory, and now its economic growth is the glory, right? And so what happens in that process? So yeah, I think that there's a lot of these sort of metaphysical moves that are made, conceptual moves that enable or lubricate or justify like doing activities in a certain negligent way, and that is absolutely, like, yeah, it's not just changing your mind. I was using a very dismissive term there, but it's like we're talking about a cosmological shift in the end. I think that's the kind of scale of transformation that has to happen, because it's not only going and like anchoring this and that. It has to happen, like a whole new mode of creating value would have to emerge that that is not yet there, at least in terms of the hegemonic order of things.
Yeah, I just would like to add that, I mean, probably like the value is, I mean, also talking from Denis Ferrer de Silva's work, the value is really the place where the proposition is sort of attached in terms of what values are there and what values are assigned, but also what values can be recreated. And while thinking about this question of value, which is, of course, like, I mean, historically determined, but also is manipulated simply in day-to-day geopolitical equations. And if I would have to internalize this discussion, and from internalize, I mean almost in the line of like sort of provincializing Europe in the Chakraborty's way, if I do not have to think about European problem, and if I have to sort of think of my own problem, which is never as binarily divided, we all know, then I would think of, for example, why was it the construct that there was an empty copper mine next to where I was born, and I could never relate it to the capacitor, which is like the smallest entity in any electronic circuit, when I tried it for the first time in the engineering school. So why these two layers were totally disconnected from me, and what were the constructs that were like blocking sort of my interrelation between that copper mine, which is like totally empty, right? Like it's like an abandoned place. It's a big hole, and this capacitor. And I mean, of course, like after so many years, there is a way in which you can think of them together. But why it didn't happen in that moment is like is probably this first layer of forgetting that I would like to think about if I would like to internalize this problem.
We have also like a commentary in the chat, and it's already also 6:10. Just shall we extend a bit further, or
yeah, let's see if anybody has a question or contribution to make. That would be not nice.
Yes, I think Katja, you have something put in the chat.
Can we see the chat?
Yes, here's the chat. Oops. Or maybe you want to say something in your own words by switching on also in the camera, if you want.
Yeah, hey there. Yes, it was just a short comment on Vinnit's kind of explanations of what he kind of thinks makes sense or what does not make sense when you actually program or when you try to be part of the system or try to kind of, not hack the system, but kind of subvert it to some extent. And I think that's in post-colonial, not just databasing, but digital humanities, quite a thing that you, at the one hand, are part of the system. At the other hand, you try to, try to hack it to some extent. And it's always difficult to do so, but that sort of relates to the kind of like overall comments of, when we do something like we're doing now, we're using up energy. And we all know that the best thing, the best energy is the energy that we're not using, but that's not going to get us to kind of a result either within or outside the system. So I just totally understand that, and I would urge you to continue kind of thinking about both the hack and the yak, and doing both the kind of thinking about these issues as well as the subversion as well, in the practical sense of trying a post-colonial databasing that kind of might not kick ass, but it might just be a good way to contribute to something that twists the system a tiny bit. That's it. Just a comment.
Thank you. Perhaps we can also Leah, and maybe then we collect a few commentaries and remarks to which then also we can respond further.
Sure. Thank you so much for this, for your conversation, your comments, and it gave me a lot to think about. And I just want to share like a little experience I had coming into the project. And Vinnit and Patricia were already working on both the website and the archival platform already for quite some time. And I already, as a student, as a bachelor student, I always had this dream of having my own kind of, Luhmann slip box with all this information and trying to build a network between them. And I never, achieved to build this kind of personal private archive. And then when you explained me the structure that you're building, and particularly the archival structure, I had this feeling of this is a better version of this kind of Luhmann slip box. And then we spoke about various labels that we could add to them and how we could categorize them and how we can think of potentially like kind of subvert the categories we somehow have to use, and with labels such as sources, like being able to put in sources that are lost, that are unheard, that are invisible. And so kind of for me as a user, I really it shares this perspective of view from like a coder or programmer. For me, I always looked at it as a user. You gave me with this code labels, a network that actually invited me to think of potential sources, actors that I can think of, even though I do not have the sources. I do not have them yet. I can imagine them. And this is how you extended the imagination of what could have been through the platform, was just a very, it is still a great enriching experience, and also helps me as a researcher. So also just thank you for developing this complexity. Yeah, and maybe I know we're lacking also a bit of time, but if you want to respond to it, my question would be, what kind of user did you imagine when you were building it? What could be a critical practice for us as user of the interface and the archive? Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Leah. If I can just add a couple of words. It was always in conversation with you and Doreen, and indeed, the idea of displacing the categories or the labels, or actually to build certain sort of memory inside these labels, which would actually remind us as researchers both what our documents can be, but also what are the documents that are out there, like the discussions around the archival absences that we had were actually generative to think about these labels inside the archive, which actually has, like, I mean, as a researcher, if you're going and uploading a document and seeing, should I mark it as a loss or should I mark it as an absence? Should I mark it as something as possibility? And then what does it mean to attach this as a category for this document? And then what are the relationships that build up of this over the period of time? So I think it was like very much collective discussion between all of us there on the archival side, I would say. And I would just probably say around the question of user, for me, it was important to, like, especially when we were defining who would actually access these documents, it was like really a question that deranged me a lot, because I mean, of course, the question of access is like such a monumental question in all of this politics of development, right? Like, who will access these documents, from where? Do the people still have smartphones and internet and probably access to the English language? And if they do, what does it mean? So how is that accessibility is kind of connected? So who the user, but also who the user in terms of what sort of agencies that they have. So when we are building roles, for example, administrator or contributor, again, what sort of subjectivities they are bringing in inside. And so how do we narrate this figure of the user using these subjectivities? So for me, many of these questions were like really there. And I don't know, like, in many times I didn't have a solution or even kind of a way to do something with it. Many times I just worked on my training. I was like, okay, we have users of 5 kinds: administrators, contributors, visitors, viewers, and different sort of accessibility, and built up a system. And so, yeah, I don't know. I think, like, I mean, of course, I've And this has been the same feeling over so many years, that I've always failed in addressing this question of human as a user. So what would we do if there was an alien as a user? Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you indeed. That sounds like really a brilliant point to end, not as an end point, but as a point of departure to think further the question of practices. And I think this is something that I really learned from this session. The quality of relations on one side also shifts to the question of the quality and the ethics of practices when it comes to a possibility to think there is now outside of these kind of actor network socialism as much implicated in extractivist orders and an economy of extraction. So if you think the cybernetic imperative to the military is connected to Friedrich Hayek's proposition that there is no data outside of the market, but this also counts for socialism as much, because we are deeply implicated in these economics and the political economy. And thank you so much for opening up the question of ethics, relations, quality, that I would connect really with ethics, the alien who is enacting those kind of practices and who can think differently, that we need to rehearse in order to not only reveal the relations of relationality, but also to propose something that really changes profoundly the quality and conditions of that relationality. And thank you so much, Ute, for coming and responding to the session today. Very much enjoyed the conversation, and also Patricia Reed, thank you so much indeed. Deep gratitude to share what you have been also thinking together and elaborating in the project, in beyond that also framework of the project. And we call it a day, oder? We call it a meeting today. It would be the greatest pleasure to all go out. We are now here having a drink. It would be so lovely to all of us joining together, but we will do this. We will have our moments in different places of the world, one sooner or later, I hope.
Thanks to
thank you.
both of you. Thanks, Vinnit. Thanks, Ute. Appreciate you both. And take care. Have a relaxing weekend. And yeah, be well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Patricia, Ute, Doreen, Leah, Radha. I was looking forward to this conversation from so many days, and like I was just thinking of this joy that would be there in this conversation. So I'll be totally lost now. I'll be like, okay, what do I do with the life? But I'll probably go and watch some TV. I wish you all a good evening.
Season finale. Scandal, yes.
Thank you also everyone joining in. Thank you, many greetings, love, bye, take care.